Hi, I'm Chris, and today I am not talking about the Claremont run, although I will update you on that real quick. It's not done. I'll come back to it. Basically, it's a lot of comics. Like, that sounds obvious, but it's a lot of comics. So I'm about over halfway through the run time-wise, but only like a third of the way through the content, with more spin-off titles and stuff as it goes. It just kind of gets exponential. It's kind of tricky because I want to talk about it as I go, but I also don't know how to format that conversation until I have a broader scope of the material. At first I thought I was really going to go issue by issue. I took so many notes on each one and it was going to be real detailed. And then now I'm realizing that's not really feasible or fun. For me, I don't know if that'll be fun to do throughout the whole thing. So I'm kind of figuring that out. I've also kind of been a little more obsessed with today's topic lately, so that's sort of taken the forefront. If my hair and makeup are any indication, today I am going to talk about dystopias, different depictions of dystopia in fiction and especially immersive media or events, specifically cyberpunk, with a relatively brief history of the genre and what was depicted in relation to what was going on in the world at the time. And then ultimately, why we enjoy immersing ourselves in art and media depicting such a bleak future. So for the last 8 years of my life, I have been attending Wasteland Weekend. It's this immersive event in the Mojave Desert based in the post-apocalyptic world of Mad Max. Now, most of my friends and family watching this, you're all well aware of what Wasteland is, but I still kind of want to start with a brief description of what it is. And honestly, that could be hard to do. It's really hard to fully understand unless you've been there. And even then, your experiences can differ so much. It's part car show, part LARP, live action roleplay, part cosplay event, part giant party, concert, swap meet, installation art exhibit. Its main influences are Mad Max, particularly the second of the series, Road Warrior, and the fourth and most recent, Fury Road. And the Fallout video game series has also become a pretty big part of the event, although many of the more science fiction or almost, I'd say, supernatural elements are very specifically absent. It's a pretty strict theme guideline. But regardless of the specific source material you're drawing from, this type of future, the one that now about 4,000 of us dedicate a tremendous amount of resources, both personally and collectively, to attend each year, is pictured as a bleak, desolate, violent one, torn apart and leveled by the actions of the old world with conflict, bombs, and ecological disaster. It's a world that looks very difficult to survive in, and the actual on-site challenges at the event definitely reinforce this. That's brutal wind and heat, so you don't really have to pretend. So a while ago, I really wanted to deconstruct, why do I like this? What draws so many of us to play in this world? Not to mention there are plenty of other post-apocalyptic, true LARPs out there too. The people I've met at Wasteland are some of my closest friends and favorite people, and as scary as the average attendee may look, they're also very likely to be incredibly kind. From my experience, many of us there are neurodivergent and or experience social anxiety, and the event offers a profound sense of community. What I find interesting and want to explore is the catharsis, I think, we experience in a unique way through the post-apocalypse. And to preface, this is very much my personal experience, based on the way that I like to enjoy the event. I tend to prefer quests, lore, bartering, kind of exploration in that way. I mean, I appreciate the cool, elaborate vehicles from afar, but I'm not in the world of creating them. Nor do I host big events, and I'm not like a performer scheduled there either. So I just want to make it clear also that you don't have to deconstruct something or analyze your enjoyment of it in order to fully appreciate it. It's totally cool to like just think it's neat. A ton of why I go is also because I get to see my friends and have fun and make costumes and little trinkets and see all the cool stuff that everyone makes. But since I like a good critical analysis, that's what I want to do. Especially because I have been gravitating more towards depictions of a cyberpunk dystopia lately, and I find that fascinating. So let's start with some operating definitions. Catharsis is defined as the process of releasing and thereby providing relief from strong or repressed emotions, the purification or purgation of emotions such as pity or fear, primarily through art, or the elimination of a complex by bringing it to consciousness and affording it expression. It's from an ancient Greek word, and it was originally used to refer to a physical process of purification until Aristotle related it to the mental process undergone by the audience while watching a theatrical work of tragedy. It's commonly applied to the horror genre, allowing us to sort of process through fear in a more safe, controlled, defined capacity. Body horror, with its cycle of ruin, release, rebirth, can be very cathartic, especially for someone experiencing body dysmorphia or gender dysphoria. Godzilla can be seen as a work of post-war catharsis for a nation experiencing the after effects of an unprecedentedly devastating man-made nuclear attack. The way a lot of people found themselves watching the movie Contagion during the COVID-19 pandemic is also a form of catharsis. So I'm going really quickly over this section, but I will link some sources to delve into this topic more, because catharsis in horror is an interesting topic to me. So after the first 2 Mad Max movies were released, George Miller, the creator and director, states in an interview, "There's a dark side to all of us collectively which we must confront in our mythologies. People say you must be very interested in violence, and in a way I am, but in relationship to death, in confronting death. I worked as a doctor for 2 years. 6 months were in a big city emergency ward where you see people in a fairly extreme state. People die, babies are born. I know that this is reflected with the 2 Mad Max films, which are fairly preoccupied with extreme situations. In that sense, I see them as having a lot of the elements of horror movies. In this way, engaging in depictions of the post-apocalypse are absolutely a cathartic way of dealing with human propensity towards violence, especially under the pressure of resource scarcity." In another interview, he says how we seem to have a need, all of us, to confront the dark side, the way we use our aggression destructively instead of positively. I don't think audiences want to see explicit violence, but they want to know what it's like to confront those dark feelings. The first Mad Max takes place in a relatively similar world to our own, except, Australian. A trajectory is in motion, but it's not until the second, Road Warrior, that the world as we know it has fully fallen apart. Oil has become extremely scarce, with the most violent and physically domineering people able to gain power and secure resources. Most smaller communities are raided and destroyed. Between this and the third installment, Beyond Thunderdome, oil scarcity reaches a breaking point and global conflict leads to worldwide nuclear attacks. By the fourth film, Fury Road, the world is ecologically destroyed to an extent that now water, not oil, is the most sought-after commodity. I love all these movies, but the themes in Fury Road are what make it my favorite. It's overtly feminist, an overt celebration of kind of the feminine. The question is repeated, who killed the world? And we're shown it was killed through taking, conquering, exploiting, consuming, hoarding, through violent patriarchal figureheads and mass destruction. And that the answer to fix it is through growth, community, working with the natural world instead of bending it to the will of consumption. And a group of femfolk are the ones who teach us that. There's something kind of comforting about the cataclysmic, mutually assured destruction of global nuclear annihilation. Like, I definitely wouldn't survive in this world in real life, but there's something comforting about playing like I'm in a desolate wasteland, in a world that was leveled and now we're starting over. That yes, it all went to hell, but it's possible to build community from the ruins. This apocalypse frees me from all the daily stressors of paying rent or getting to work on time. The violence presented is extreme, but it's something I can wrap my head around. It's pervasive, but it's not necessarily systemic, because large-scale societal systems have collapsed. But lately,
I couldn't help but wonder.
The catharsis that I think I need from my apocalyptic experience has changed. It kind of goes beyond death and violence and destruction. It's a bigger fear, an overarching feeling that we're doomed, that it's too late to avert the disastrous effects of climate change and overconsumption, that we'll never be able to make the shifts that we desperately need to in time, and that it's all because of mindless greed, that incomprehensible whims of the very few determining the fate of everyone else, that it won't get better, it will mutate and stratify society further, causing more destruction to the most vulnerable, making corporations that caused it richer and more powerful, and the common folk beholden to them in order to survive. A world not bulldozed and reset, but built up ever higher upon the decaying structures so nefarious that we don't even realize we're in it with no way to stop. Let's talk about cyberpunk. The concept of cyberpunk brings to mind many things, especially like striking visuals. A dark, rainy city drenched in neon with towering screens on the sides of skyscrapers. Hard-boiled protagonists. Cybernetic enhancements and biologically integrated technology. Extremes in class disparity. Noodle shops. Wondering what defines personhood and humanity. The extreme invasiveness of ads and mega corporate control. Women with really cool bangs that make me think I should get bangs, even though I'm definitely going to regret it once I have to maintain them in any way. The guiding ethos of high-tech, low-life. 2 years ago, an event called Metropolis was started by the same organizers in the same place with a largely similar attendee group as Wasteland Weekend. Except this one is in a cyberpunk future. It's still in the desert, but it's like a sci-fi experience on a desert planet. And so far, it's been a smaller event overall, which I actually really like, but the possible sources of media and material to incorporate are incredibly vast. So now I'm going to take some time to go over some notable or favorite cyberpunk works, what themes are present, and how I think they relate to and express what the world was experiencing or fearing when they were created. And as a caveat, I'm going to be discussing mostly Western events in media, predominantly the US, since that's the culture and society that I live in and am more affected by and more fit to analyze. Japan in particular had its own version of the cyberpunk genre develop in the 80s with more like true punk roots, and kind of an interesting focus on body horror. Core films of the 80s being Akira in 1988, adapted from the manga series spanning from 1982 to 1990, Tetsuo the Iron Man in 1989, and Ghost in the Shell in 1995, adapted from the 89 manga the same name. Other influential series include manga series Battle Angel Alita from 1990 to 95, and Blame in 1997, as well as the anime series Cowboy Bebop from 98 to 1999. As important, as exciting as these works are, I'm not really going to be covering them in this video, so I just wanted to acknowledge them and their cultural significance, and the fact that I really like them as well, before getting into sort of the history of Western cyberpunk as it relates to those specific cultural anxieties. First is Metropolis. Released in 1927 and written and directed by Fritz Lang, who was born in Austria and worked in Germany during the Weimar period, which is post-World War I and pre-World War II, and then later in the US. Though this predates the term cyberpunk by many decades, I and many others kind of consider it part of the genre. The film is stunning. The world of Metropolis is separated into the elite who live in this beautiful city above ground, and the working class who live underground, never able to see the sun, working like cogs in a grand machine. The early 1900s saw rapid advancements in technology and science, as well as more automated production and increased industrialization. It's often referred to as the Second Industrial Revolution. Assembly lines and mass production, along with the period of turmoil post-World War I, meant that the future was really uncertain and unpredictable in these unprecedented new ways. Industrial output and productivity in post-World War I Germany were heavily emphasized, and you can see Metropolis sort of grapple with humanity and utilitarianism like many of the works it will inspire. It's also a perfect example of German expressionism, which used a lot of visual extremes to kind of capture the collective trauma felt after World War I, which influenced the advent of film noir in the 40s, which led to neo-noir in the 80s, but I digress, we're not there yet. Personally, I would love to see an Art Deco revival in the way we visualize cyberpunk. You can kind of see its influences, like in the corpo aesthetic especially, but I think it could be emphasized a lot more overtly. Cyberpunk proper, however, isn't really coined and solidified until the 1980s. But let's briefly look at some of the works in the 60s and 70s leading up to that. I talk about this in my comic history video as well, but the 60s were a big time of disillusionment and increasing distrust in authority, which manifests clearly in a lot of art and media from that time. The 60s sees the Vietnam War, the very real threat of global nuclear annihilation and the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Kennedy assassination, and protesters fighting for civil rights and being confronted with violent authoritarian opposition. We also see huge technological advances with lasers, satellites, and the first humans in space, and computing technology laying the groundwork for computers as we know them today. Subsets of science fiction steer away from a more optimistic and fantastical view of the future and towards a darker, more philosophical version of what it could be. Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep is a novel by Philip K. Dick, published in 1968, that asks the fundamental questions about how we can truly define humanity through the story of Deckard, a bounty hunter whose job is to retire old models of escaped androids, synthetic beings that appear human but aren't. In a speech in 1972, the author says, "In a very real sense, our environment is becoming alive, or at least quasi-alive, and in ways specifically and fundamentally analogous to ourselves. Rather than learning about ourselves by studying our constructs, perhaps we should make the attempt to comprehend what our constructs are up to by looking into what we ourselves are up to." Essentially, the androids hold up a mirror to humanity, and the idea of empathy defining personhood falling apart under Deckard's examination of his own increasing lack of empathy. This novel is the basis for one of the most pivotal and iconic cyberpunk works, the 1982 film Blade Runner. But before that, we need to take a quick detour into the French cyberpunk comics of the 1970s. Metal Hurlant, which translates directly to Howling Metal, was created in 1974 by Les Humanoids Associés, the United Humanoids, a collective of 4. Comic artists Jean Giraud, aka Mobius, and Philippe Drouet, writer and journalist Jean-Pierre Dionnet, and director of finances Bernard Farkas. We always need a Bernard. We can't all be comic artists and writers. We need a director of finances. It's not going to be me, but we need one. It was an anthology series of horror and sci-fi comics that was later translated and released and then expanded in its own right in the US as Heavy Metal. What is notable is that it was not bound by the Comics Code Authority, and it was able to be more explicit and subversive than other stuff going on in the US at that time. One very notable story is The Long Tomorrow. It's a short story written by Dan O'Bannon and illustrated by Mobius, and it's incredibly gorgeous. Just look at this. Oh. This visual language directly influenced Blade Runner as well as Neuromancer, the 1984 novel by William Gibson. Gibson himself said, "So it's entirely fair to say, and I've said it before, that the way Neuromancer, the novel, looks was heavily influenced in part by some of the artwork I saw in heavy metal. I assume this must also be true of John Carpenter's Escape from New York, Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, and all other artifacts of the style sometimes dubbed cyberpunk. Those French guys, they got their end in early." Fun fact, I actually have a couple issues of Mittelherland. I can't read French well enough to really understand what's going on, but I'm working on it. And they're pretty cool. There's a lot of it in black and white, a lot of different visual styles. It's pretty cool just to see and to have a part of that history. This leads us into the 1980s, when the cyberpunk genre started to be defined in the way that we perceive it today. It's a decade that kicks off with the election of Ronald Reagan as President of the United States, and it is hard to overstate the negative effects that his administration had and continues to have on our country. His policies include the implementation of trickle-down economics, or Reaganomics, which basically gave more money to those who already had the most wealth in hopes that they'd share it, and trying to strip away power from labor unions. He completely ignored the AIDS crisis and in turn villainized the LGBTQ+ community, which led to even more death within that community, stripped away necessary funding for social programs, started the war on drugs, criminalized many of society's most vulnerable, to name a few. In fact, a lot of why the noir and neo-noir genre resurged during this time can be seen as a direct response to Reagan's America and the hyper-traditional norms that he represented. In a really interesting essay about 80s noir, Robert Arnett states, "The mainstream genres of the mid-1980s relied on the conventional narrative structure of upsetting a status quo only to put it back together in ways that embrace the cultural hegemony of Reagan's America. Essentially, wherein the American dream becomes reality." He explains that the noir genre questions what other genres reaffirm. They reject when other genres reassure. So going back to our technology timeline, we start to see more personally accessible technology in the 70s and into the 80s, including the first email network, the first personal computers, Walkmans, floppy disks, digital cameras, and early video games. And as the 80s continue, things get even more personally accessible, with media easier to access than ever on demand through VCRs, home printers, home gaming consoles, cable TV, and the invention of the CD. Fax machines, answering machines, cordless phones, and slightly more accessible mobile phones changed communication, and this was a time of huge advancement in the world of personal computers, including the integration of the graphical user interface. So there weren't just lines of text, it was actually visually appealing and usable. And people not only had easier access to consume more information and media, but to produce it as well. So this is all to say, the birth of cyberpunk as we know it today makes sense. It can be hard to sort of paint a accurate timeline of technological advances because things will be invented way earlier than they're actually personally accessible, and then that's another time before they're widely adopted. So just take this kind of with a grain of salt. I'm trying to not get too into the weeds with years and stuff, more just kind of paint a picture of what was starting to be used when. In 1982, the film Blade Runner was released, directed by Ridley Scott and based on the aforementioned Philip K. Dick novel. While not an immediate hit, it became a cult classic, especially after the release of the director's cut in 1992, with its neo-noir sensibilities in a city that's always dark but illuminated with ads and neon lights, and its exploration of empathy and humanity through the mirror held up by the synthetic replicants. It's a quintessential cyberpunk experience. In 1984, the novel Neuromancer by William Gibson was published. But in contrast to Blade Runner, I feel like sentience and personhood are explored kind of through AI and the abstraction of self, especially as they enter cyberspace. I absolutely adore this book, as well as the other two set in the same world that make up the Sprawl trilogy, Count Zero in 1986 and Mona Lisa Overdrive in 1988. Gibson actually coined the term cyberspace in a short story, Burning Chrome, then popularized it in Neuromancer. And what really gets me about Neuromancer and like the Sprawl trilogy as a whole is the way that he depicts cyberspace and the virtual reality data space called the Matrix. In both Count Zero and Mona Lisa Overdrive, the story is presented through different threads, switching between completely different characters each chapter basically until their stories culminate and intertwine, which I just like anyway. But you also get to see a bunch of different facets of the world, how this platforms some but disenfranchises others, and how advanced technology is accessed and understood by different groups. Reading it today, it honestly surprised me how not dated it felt. And maybe that's because Gibson was more concerned with the story he was telling and kind of the poetry within this abstract cyberspace than the actual mechanics of it. This is a long quote, but I found it really fascinating. On the most basic level, computers in my books are simply a metaphor for human memory. I'm interested in the hows and whys of memory, the ways it defines who and what we are, and how easily memory is subject to revision. When I was writing Neuromancer, it was wonderful to be able to tie a lot of these interests into the computer metaphor. It wasn't until I could finally afford a computer of my own that I found out there's a drive mechanism inside, this little thing that spins around. And I've been expecting an exotic crystalline thing, a cyberspace deck or something, and what I got was a little piece of a Victorian engine that made noises like a scratchy old record player. That noise took away some of the mystique for me. It made computers less sexy. My ignorance had allowed me to romanticize them. I'm skipping ahead. There's a lot in the 80s, and I'm trying not to get too bogged down by my desire to be comprehensive. So now I want to discuss the 90s and the lead up to Y2K. It's a decade bookended by the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and 9/11 in 2001. And it's a time of great change, optimism, but also disillusionment. The Soviet Union was officially dissolved in 1991, same year as the first Gulf War, and the same year that the internet becomes fully available with no commercial restrictions. In 1992, Bill Clinton is elected president, and the Mall of America opens. NAFTA is signed by Canada, Mexico, and the US in 1994. The World Trade Organization forms in 1995, and by the end of the decade, you have Clinton's impeachment proceedings, Napster, the iMac, the widespread adoption of the internet, the dot-com bubble, and the first cloned sheep. I'm focusing mostly on the US here. But the beginning of the decade started out optimistic for many, especially with the Cold War anxieties put at ease and the US economy doing really well. But meanwhile, especially towards the end of the decade, a lot of people are feeling really disillusioned, less connected in meaningful ways to the world around them. There's an element of flippant nihilism, snarky irony, a wry distrust, a general cynicism, of sincerity being couched in sarcasm and jaded nonchalance.
Don't worry, I don't have low self-esteem. It's a mistake.
I'll say.
I have low esteem for everyone else.
Overall, the picture that I'm trying to paint is one of increasing globalization, more overtly unbridled capitalism, and the idea of personal freedom through consumption, of liberation being achieved by a group or individual's ability to participate in capitalism. While not branded as such until later, think like girl boss feminism, kind of that the end goal and marker of freedom is the ability to participate fully and uncritically in capitalism and its systems. Before I get into specific works from this period, let's talk about the Doomsday event positioned firmly at the end of the decade. mean, I was alive during Y2K, but I was too young to really be expected to do anything about it. I just kind of remember it coming up on a lot of different TV shows.
Ben says to successfully survive the millennium, we'll need money and canned food.
I tell you what, man, them Y2K, man, they know when the mainframe's gonna come crashing down on that grid, man. They look like a damn apocalypse now, man. They don't line up now. The horror.
And honestly, up until making this video, I always thought that it was something everyone thought would be catastrophic, but it turned out okay, and people overreacted. And it turns out that is completely wrong. I was very incorrect. The crisis was only averted due to many people working tirelessly to fix the issue, and the persistence of people who understood what a big deal this is. So basically, the way that the date writing method for most computer systems at the time worked was by making the year just the last 2 digits. So, for example, 2023 would just be 23. And this was a really smart way to save space, especially in the 70s when a lot of these programs were created. Computer storage space was even more limited. However, this would be a huge problem when 2000 came, since the computers would read it as 1990.
Many applications will either stop working or produce erroneous results, since their logic cannot accept the transition when the dates change from 99 to 00.
If today were December the 31st, 1999, and our systems were in the current state they are in today, tomorrow our economy worldwide would stop. It wouldn't grind to a halt. It would snap to a halt. You would not have dial tone tomorrow if tomorrow were January the 1st, year 2000. You would not have air travel. You would not have Federal Express. You would not have the Postal Service. You would not have water. You would not have power, because the systems are broken.
It was a huge deal, and a lot of people came out of retirement just to help with this. So, thank you to all of them. I did not understand, and I'm glad I do now. Which leads us to Snow Crash. Published in 1992 and written by the prolific Neil Stephenson, it's a foundational cyberpunk text up there with Neuromancer, and one that I personally love. Stevenson is credited with popularizing the term avatar to describe a personal visual representation in a digital space, as well as creating the term metaverse. It focuses on pizza delivery driver hero protagonist, as well as YT, a teenage skateboard courier. I wouldn't describe it as jaded, more casually self-aware. Stevenson describes it himself as kind of a parody of dystopian novels, that the tropes had become familiar, so rehashing them without any self-awareness or humor would have been a little weird. In this world, corporations own everything, to a hyperbolic degree. Cities, states, highways, currency, everything is owned and operated by corporate franchises. People are disconnected and isolated geographically, and characters in this universe can access and spend time in the metaverse, a virtual reality space that allows you to build, create, and represent yourself the way you want. But it does operate still with many of the physical and social constraints of physical reality. There are still power systems and structures in place. The metaverse is owned by a very wealthy man, not its users. Hero lives in a dingy storage unit in the physical world, but has this beautiful space that he's created for himself in the metaverse. It feels freeing and like a place where he feels successful and expressive. Yet without realizing it, he's sort of found freedom through systems similar to the ones that have oppressed him. It's just that in this world, as a skilled hacker, he has the particular resources that advantage him more than in the physical world. He has the ability to freely consume, but he's not truly free. While they are able to manipulate the virtual environment, they are not able to alter the structure of the metaverse. Throughout the entire decade, especially in the second half, there was a huge boom in cyberpunk art, media, aesthetics. And The Matrix came out in 1999, which was hugely popular. And then at the end of the decade, we have Metropolitan, a comic series spanning from 1997 to 2002, written by Warren Ellis and designed/co-created by Derek Robertson. It opens with Spider Jerusalem, a retired journalist doing an unintentional Alan Moore cosplay and living relatively peacefully by himself in the mountains. He gets forced to come back to the city and resume his work, and the series basically follows him exposing the corruption, abuse, and exploitation of the city, albeit very unconventionally. Calling Spider, rebellious is kind of an understatement. He's inspired loosely by Hunter S. Thompson and Warren Ellis himself. Alright, let's talk about Warren Ellis. So I'm usually pretty good about making sure the people I talk about haven't been revealed to be Nazis or TERFs or sexual predators, but this one slipped by me, and it's big. Over 60 women and femme-presenting folk have publicly come forward with allegations against Warren Ellis of sexual manipulation, coercion, grooming, and emotional abuse, among other things. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail since this is a pretty heavy subject to just drop in the middle of a video, but I do encourage you to go to their website, somanyofus.com, to learn more about their experiences if you want. Just a heads up, they are intense. And, I still like Trans Metropolitan in a lot of ways, and comics are a collaborative medium of much more than just the writer, but I honestly struggle to enjoy his work after knowing all this. And it definitely recontextualizes a lot of stuff, like Spider's relationship with his younger female assistants, the way women are treated and portrayed throughout, and it's just really super disappointing. And I didn't realize until after I had completely finished and exported this video, which is why this is audio only, since that's a lot easier for me to just throw in. I'm leaving the rest of the section because of the themes that I wanted to get at, but I just wanted to make sure that I'm giving you all of the necessary information and context on any material I present. And if you want to read Trans Metropolitan, maybe just get it from the library or read it illegally online. Don't give him money, maybe. He's definitely skeptical and jaded, but it's seething. His nihilism isn't flippant, to me at least. His anger and angst aren't casual or ironic. He definitely cares. He's not apathetic. It feels more like sincerity twisted by a world that has no place for it. So in that way, it feels like a criticism of the mentality a lot of art and media had at this point that I talked about earlier. The world of Trans Metropolitan, which, side note, looks heavily inspired by Mobius, which is cool. He actually did an alternate cover for an issue later on, is full of violence and advertising. It trivializes and commodifies anything at all meaningful. Sex, death, love, connection, and it promotes liberation through consumption. I'm not going to get into the whole series, but there's an early issue that really got me. It's about this woman who's cryogenically frozen, and she wakes up in this reality years later, only to discover that the world doesn't have room for her or her stories. All the things, all the history that she's seen and lived, no one really has the desire to hear it. And I don't want to spoil too much, but basically it's a world with no room for sincerity. Author David Foster Wallace has this quote about art at the end of the millennium that irony is useful for debunking illusions, but most of the illusion debunking in the US has already now been done and redone. Few artists dare to try to talk about ways of working towards redeeming what's wrong, because they'll look sentimental and naive to all the weary ironists. Irony's gone from liberating to enslaving. Yeah, I quote David Foster Wallace. I'm reading Infinite Jest. Into the early 2000s, there were a lot of big budget action movies set in a cyberpunk world, probably inspired by the success of The Matrix, like the sequels to The Matrix, Minority Report, iRobot, Paycheck. Remember Paycheck? I totally forgot about this movie. Ultraviolet, as well as a live-action adaptation of the adult animated show Aeon Flux. Looking back, though, none of these really speak to me still now. I liked Dark Angel when I was younger. It's sort of biopunk, but I'm not sure it really holds up.
It must be my feline DNA, because when I look at this little face, I see dinner.
My sister had a crush on Jessica Alba. There's a lot of content, but it feels different. And I think kind of the mainstream success and commercialization of cyberpunk kind of put the genre into a hiatus after this. The best examples from this time probably lie in video games. The PlayStation 2 came out in 2000 and the Xbox and GameCube in 2001. So this really opened up the medium to explore this and many other subject matters in a way that it couldn't as easily before. The first Deus Ex game came out in 2000 and then released a sequel in 2003. And I know there's a ton to talk about with that, and it's like widely regarded as one of the best games ever made, and it's really important to a lot of people, but I never played it at the time. It's not as personally relevant to me, and this is my video, and it's already probably going to be really long, so I'll put a video about Deus Ex if you want to hear more about it. I acknowledge its importance. There's also a lot more sci-fi, just in general, during this time. The dot-com bubble basically ended around 2000, and internet is more widely adopted than ever before, growing from 16 million users in 1995 to 458 million in 2000 to 1,018 million by the end of 2005. The digital world is new. It's a merging of the physical and the abstract. More people are learning and speaking the language of computers. Cell phones are starting to be a common thing. You can connect with other people and other ideas in just unimaginable new ways. And aesthetically, I think we can place it as like a modern retrofuturism. When I hear retrofuturism, I usually think of like the 50s or the 70s, but this is totally that too. And it even kind of fits the 20 to 30 year trend cycle. Organic forms made from inorganic materials, the backdrop of space, and visions of a utopian future are prevalent. Things change pretty significantly after 9/11. The US starts a war in Afghanistan and in Iraq in the next couple years. Hurricane Katrina hits in 2005. And global warming becomes a much more widely known concern, especially after An Inconvenient Truth came out in 2006. And then in 2008, Barack Obama is elected. Everything feels hopeful again. I feel like I'm kind of straying from the topic of cyberpunk, but that's because from around 2005 to like 2015, it kind of stopped being as prominent. Like, there's still some examples from this time, even ones I like. You got Mirror's Edge in 2008, District 9 in 2009, and Black Mirror sometimes. Ready Player One was published in 2011, and Chappie came out in 2015. And technology changes immensely. Oh my god, like now we have iPods, camera phones, and in 2004 we get Facebook, YouTube in 2005, the iPhone, Netflix streaming in 2007, iPads, Instagram, 4G networks in 2010, ride-sharing apps in 2011. And over the past 10 years, technology has gotten sleeker, faster, smarter, more pervasive. We have incredible access to information. We can connect and interact with people all over the world, but we also have less privacy. Our data is commodified. Our social media, for better or for worse, has radically shaped the social landscape. I mean, it's not revolutionary to say, but we're simultaneously more connected and more disconnected than ever before.
We used to colonize land. That was the thing you could expand into, and that's where money was to be made. We colonized the entire earth. There was no other place for the businesses and capitalism to expand into, and then they realized human attention. That they are now trying to colonize every minute of your life. That is what these people are trying to do. Every single free moment you have is a moment you could be looking at your phone and they could be gathering information to target ads at you. That's what's happening. It's coming. It's coming for every free second you have.
But that idea of our very minds being colonized is scary and eerily accurate. That as late-stage capitalism continues to snowball with this cancerous idea of exponential expansion, our very selves are starting to be chipped away at and sold. Which, to groups who have had their culture brutalized by colonization, is not so new. Let's talk about indigenous futurism and Afro-cyberpunk for a minute. Rebecca Roanhorse says in her article entitled Postcards from the Apocalypse, "To be a native of North America is to exist in a space where the past and future mix in a delicate swirl of the here and now. We stand with one foot always in the darkness that ended our world, and the other in a hope for our future as Indigenous people. It is from this apocalyptic in-between that the Indigenous voices in speculative fiction speak." I don't know if you've noticed, but most of the works that I've talked about so far have been, like, white cis men. And that doesn't mean their work isn't important, or that I can't love it as much as I do, but it did make me speculate about other perspectives in the genre that I might not be so familiar with. So I started researching that. The novel Red Spider White Web is a cyberpunk novel from 1990 written by Misha, an Indigenous Metis woman, from that specific perspective, which sounds really cool. Unfortunately, it's like out of print, seemingly, with no ebook version available, but I think I found the publisher, and like the impression that I get is that they still print it kind of on demand, but either way, I ordered it. I gave them $20. I didn't get an email, but I'll get back to you. It's just important to know that those voices were and are there. Another notable work is Robopocalypse, a 2011 novel from author Daniel H. Wilson, an Indigenous Cherokee man, basically about a robot uprising that kills most of the human population, and then our last hope for humanity is this Indigenous stronghold. You get to see the resilience and ingenuity of a group of people that are often entirely excluded from the narrative and a story that makes them the focus. Skipping ahead to 2018, I want to talk about Janelle Monae's Dirty Computer. It's the name of the album as well as the accompanying film, which Monae calls an emotion picture. It's brilliant, like, just watch it if you haven't already. But basically, the premise is that in the future, people who don't conform to this mandated, hyper-traditional lifestyle, or who try to resist it in any way, are captured and their memories are wiped. It's futuristic and stylized, but this is exactly what colonizers do to groups they want to oppress. They try to strip away the group's culture, their stories, their collective memories, and ultimately their identities, often in an attempt to exploit their labor, as we see in this film. And with the 2016 election and all the hate and fascism that rose with it, this couldn't be more relevant. In Monae's earlier albums, The Archandroid in 2010 and The Electric Lady in 2013, she also uses cyberpunk themes and these Afrofuturist motifs to, as Christine Capitola writes, create her own black, queer, feminist version of cyberpunk through interfacing her body and musical technology. Essentially using this music technology to find and create freedom from oppressive power structures. I think it's worth looking back and elevating some of these works that live more on the margins of the genre at the moment. Because cyberpunk, from like a critical standpoint, has an often fraught relationship with its women and non-white characters. American cyberpunk often represents and is influenced by Japanese culture and technology, but it can often fall into Orientalism, or more accurately, techno-Orientalism. Orientalism, in this context, refers to the othering way in which Western media can portray Eastern cultures and people, often making them seem scary, mysterious, dangerous, backwards, exoticized, and fetishized. Often somehow not as human, which, I mean, obviously is damaging for many reasons. And with techno-Orientalism, it's othering on the opposite side of the spectrum. English professors and media scholars David S. Rowe, Betsy Wong, and Dr. Greta A. New, in their book Techno-Orientalism, Imagining Asia in Speculative Fiction, History, and Media, explain it as, while Orientalism defines a modern West by producing a polar opposite and pre-modern East, Techno-Orientalism symmetrically yet contradictorily completes this project by creating a collective futurized Asia to further affirm the West's centrality. Basically, they're opposite sides of the spectrum, but they're still otherized. Cultural retrograde with technical hyper-advancement. And in many ways, the use of Japan in 1980s cyberpunk is reflective of the misguided collective American fear and anxieties about not being as dominant a cultural force in the future. As I engage more in and kind of create my own versions of a cyberpunk world and my own visions and depictions of how that looks, I think it's just important to be critical and conscious of how and why I'm using Eastern motifs and symbols to do that. Like, I always really liked the idea of cyberpunk being this swirl of different cultures as globalization continues in the future. And honestly, I guess that's kind of how I always saw the incorporation of that culture. But it's not that simple, and it's worth interrogating as the genre continues and develops in the 2020s. It kind of feels like cyberpunk is back, and that we could be in like a new era of the genre. And maybe an evolution of it, who knows? Cyberpunk was just called sci-fi until it crystallized into something new. In the last few years, we've gotten shows like Love, Death and Robots, Altered Carbon, Cyberpunk Edgerunners, movies like Blade Runner 2049, the live-action Alita Battle Angel, and video games like Cyberpunk 2077, Cloudpunk, and Stray. I think a lot of us are feeling that dread that I talked about earlier, that deep, pervasive doom. A lot of millennials aren't having kids because we can't afford to, and many of us fear the future that we'd be bringing them into if we did. I'm scared. I'm scared about the world, about climate change, about corporate exploitation, about the injustice that I don't know how to fix. And I think there's power in seeing people who care keep going in a world that reflects these fears. Part of cyberpunk's very definition is that it's a dystopia. When characters find happiness and meaning and connection, it's often a very deliberate choice, or an act of resistance even. There's this quote from the Snagglepuss comics. Yeah, it's that Snagglepuss, it's a whole thing, where he essentially says that sometimes you don't fight to win, you fight to show that it can be done. The human spirit's pretty incredible. Like, we have this drive to endure and survive even when we don't expect it. My grandfather on my mom's side was a very interesting man. He's just the definition of a character. And he always said, like, he'd go out quick on his own terms. He'd have like a cyanide pill ready. But when he was diagnosed with brain cancer, which would later kill him, he hung on until the last moment that he possibly could. And when I look at all these times in history that felt like the end, it gives me comfort to know how bleak the world seemed to others before me, and that people kept going. Maybe the most powerful part of acting out these bleak futures is that the community, love, expression, and creativity that I feel at these events gives me courage through the rest of the year. The pandemic saw people come together in amazing ways, but it also, fundamentally shattered my belief in people in a new way. And I cherish the moments that I get to be with people who give me hope. There's a real power in that, and in being able to imagine the potential of a positive future. In their work about envisioning real utopias and how to actually create them, Eric Olin Wright says, most people in the world today, especially in the economically developed regions of the world, no longer believe in this possibility. Capitalism seems to most people part of the natural order of things, and pessimism has replaced the optimism of the will that Gramsci once said was essential if the world was to be transformed. Essentially, we can't get somewhere better if we can't envision it, at least in some way. And maybe that's what I'm doing. Not just catharsis, but a subversion of what a possibly dystopian future has to look like. Acting out the post-apocalypse on my terms, with people that I trust. A redirection of the narrative. Even just a tiny bit of hope, no matter how small, that even if the worst happens, it might just all be okay. At least in some moments. Thanks for watching. A lot of the subject matter is stuff I've been talking to people about lately, and it's been on my mind. The fun parts of Cyberpunk and the doom. There's a lot of resources I mentioned, and I'll link them all below. I did a lot of research, and there's a lot of extraneous videos that I like, that are fun. So if you want to check those out, they will be available. Thank you.
But naive optimism can be dangerous, and denial a treacherous bedfellow.
Continue to pretend there isn't a problem coming. Doomsday scenarios are conceivable.
It's because of naive optimism and denial that most corporate and government leaders have waited so long to address this problem.
No one is telling 100% of the truth.
In fact, as a society, we've been conditioned to expect that happy ending. But there won't be a happy ending if we don't prepare.
Everyone is frightened about their stock position. Everyone is frightened about their credit rating.
The enormity of the problem is staggering. Knowing when a river will flood your town, but not being able to convince anyone to start stacking the 1 million sandbags needed to handle the floodwaters.
Remember, individuals can make a difference. You can make a difference. If we are prepared mentally, physically, spiritually, and emotionally, and are willing to take action, we can begin to turn this crisis into opportunity, an opportunity for greatness. May each of us take that step starting today, and may God be with us.